Good afternoon. Welcome to the NSSB Auditorium. I'll go over a few rules of protocol for this unclassified meeting. No classified discussions are permitted. Please remove your batteries from government-owned cell phones. No cell phones should be allowed in this building at this point. Two-way pagers and personal cell phones obviously not permitted. There's a special notation at this point for the historical lecture series. Currently in this venue, the only uncleared person under escort at this venue is our distinguished presenter. So all L-cleared and escort people should exit immediately. Let's see, if there were an emergency, any of the exits on either side of the auditorium are available. Someone will point you to the nearest outside exit, and providing there's an electrical storm going on out there, I guess you would muster at the 1400 muster area at the northeast corner of the Ottawee building. And that looks like that. So one special notation for this particular Heritage Lecture Series is today's speaker, Fred Reby, was a laboratory employee and Q clearance holder for many years. Fred no longer holds a clearance, able to brief him on current classification rulings. Due to this limitation, we have chosen to hold today's lecture in a secure setting to ensure that Fred doesn't inadvertently share classified information with uncleared employees. I know you understand that. Since Fred does not have a clearance, now here's the point I want you to listen to, is since he does not have a clearance, please refrain from having both classified conversations while he's in the area, but during today's question and answer session, and Roger Mead will introduce our speaker.
Thank you all for coming to what is our 10th of the Laboratory's Heritage Lecture Series. These series are sponsored by IRM RMSSO, and we're enormously proud of them and proud of today's speaker. As Bob said, my name is Roger Mead. J. Robert Oppenheimer, our first director, lung cancer on February 18, 1967. He was just 62 years old. Abraham Peiss said of Oppenheimer, and I quote, "Any single one of the following contributions would have marked Oppenheimer out as a preeminent scientist: his own research work in physics, his influence as a teacher, his leadership at Los Alamos, the growth of the Institute of Advanced Studies as a leading center of theoretical physics, and his efforts to promote a more common understanding of science. When all is combined, we honor Oppenheimer as a great leader of science. When all is interwoven with climate that condoned witch hunts, Oppenheimer also had friends who were courageous enough to support him during the darkest period of his life. The most courageous of Oppenheimer's friends lived and worked here at Los Alamos. Our speaker today, Fred Reby, was a young staff member just 3 years out of the University of Chicago when he became the first signer of a petition protesting the treatment of Oppenheimer at the hands of the Atomic Energy Commission. Fred became and was the spokesperson for everyone at the laboratory who believed in Oppenheimer. Fred began his long and distinguished career at Los Alamos in 1951, starting as a staff member in the physics division, working on high energy accelerator design, later advancing to group leader and to the leadership of the Controlled Thermonuclear Division. He's a fellow of both the American Physical Society and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He retired from Los Alamos in 1977 to accept a professorship in nuclear engineering at the University of Washington, becoming an emeritus professor in 1989. Fred is a member of the J. Robert Oppenheimer Memorial Committee, which promotes the memory of Oppenheimer by providing scholarships to high school seniors in northern New Mexico. A few years ago, Bob Brownlee stood before you and spoke of the heroes and giants of our past. Today, we will hear from one of those giants, Fred Reby.
There goes. I'm going to, as the poster is, as you've seen the poster, which advertised my talk today, it's going to be about events in 1954, to some degree about 1953. The crux of the matter is covered in this book, which was printed in 54, shortly after the Oppenheimer security hearings, which are the subject of my talk. Anytime you want to read it, it's only about just short of 1,000 pages. So we're talking about the 1954 Oppenheimer security proceedings, and they were entitled In the Matter of J. Robert Oppenheimer. Subject of my talk will be largely the proceedings themselves, and as you can see from the bullet, I'll do some background. Then we get right into the proceedings with the AEC charges, the Gray Commission hearings, the Gray Commission findings, the AEC findings, the Los Alamos response directly after the Gray Commission findings, and a little bit of the afterward. The proceedings for charging Oppenheimer were first, since it was a security hearing, to have to appoint a commission, which was the Gray Commission, who then reported its findings to the AEC. So here we have Oppenheimer, the wartime leader with his wartime badge, and as is well known by now, Oppenheimer and General Groves led the Manhattan bomb project at Los Alamos during 43 to 45 to develop the fission weapons. Picture of Oppenheimer and Groves at the Trinity site, which was the implosion-type fission weapon with a plutonium core, which was fully tested in July of 45. For background, I list a partial list of nuclear explosions. There was a Trinity fission device, July 15, 45. The Hiroshima fission device, delivered on the city of Hiroshima, Japan, August 6. Nagasaki fission device, August 9. To skip ahead to the fusion thermonuclear devices, there was the Mike fusion device of October 30th, 52. When I got to the lab in 51, the big push, the big central job of the laboratory was thermonuclear weapons. And of course, the Mike device, which was a liquid device. Louis Rosen is in the audience, and he measured the DT neutrons from that device. Later on, the Castle Bravo fusion device, which was a solid device, in 54. I was out at the Castle test in 54, the time that Oppenheimer gave his farewell seminar address at Los Alamos. So here are the concepts which are important to understanding. I need scarcely tell this audience about them, but I'll go through it for historical purposes. The super, which was the device first conceived part of the politics and the controversy that developed had to do with the fact that Oppenheimer and most working bomb scientists concluded that the super would not work. That was fairly well known, even though there were a number of advocates who advocated that the super, even given the state of its scientific uncertainty, should be pursued strongly. Oppenheimer and bomb scientists recognized that the Teller-Ulam design would work, and it was the basis for subsequent H-bombs, thermonuclear weapons. There's a famous quote from Oppenheimer, who had, when he was told and made to understand the Teller-Ulam concept, he described the physics as sweet. So the controversy that developed over the development of the hydrogen bomb began with the super concept. As I've said, enthusiasts on one side urged all-out development, while others, including Oppenheimer, urged hydrogen bomb. Began with the super, that it was often, opposition to the super concept was often confused with opposition to the Teller-Ulam concept, which finally worked. So in 1953, and earlier than that, the general manager of the AEC, General Nichols, wrote a letter block showing the blank wall with Eisenhower and Chairman Strauss, who was chairman of the AEC, and Oppenheimer on one side, saying who's being walled off from what. So then, after that, in the spring following this winter letter from General Nichols, who was the manager of the AEC, a letter of charges was brought forth by the AEC, which you can see here. Communist associations in the 30s and 40s. Of course, Oppenheimer had been following his stint in Europe in even the late 20s, where he got his PhD at the University of Göttingen. He came to the United States and assumed Chevalier had been approached by a man named Eltonton, who had asked Chevalier on behalf of someone in the Soviet consulate to approach Oppenheimer to see if there was any way of getting information, a sense of friendship and chivalry to the security people, and that got him in trouble later. Then, of course, he was accused of opposing and delaying the development of the hydrogen bomb. I might say that prior to 54, 53, during the 50s, there were various projects to which Oppenheimer was a signatory, where he introduced something called the VISTA Project, where he presented the findings of the VISTA Project to President Eisenhower, who looked very favorably upon it, and it was simply to the effect that there should be more openness to the American people about these matters, and that we should try to seek some sort of dialogue with the Soviets. And Eisenhower actually bought that. So we come to the Security Board, which was convened to hear the charges against Oppenheimer. And that happened between April 12th and May 6th of 1954. Gordon Gray, because he ended up giving a minority opinion, it was a security hearing which shouldn't have had something called defense and prosecution, but I use those terms anyway. Lloyd P. Garrison, who headed Oppenheimer's defense, was a senior partner of the New York law firm. And interestingly, for those of you who remember your Civil War type history, a descendant of the abolitionist William Garrison. He'd been a board member of the American Civil Liberties Union and was later dean at the Wisconsin Law School. Prosecutor, who headed the examination for the commission, for the board, Roger Robb, who had been, as you see, assistant district attorney, and later was, I think, appointed by President Reagan to the U.S. Court of Appeals. So here are the Gray Board witnesses, wonderful names from that time, largely scientists, not all. You can see the list. I will mention some. Lansdale was a security person during the war. You see Fermi, Robbie, Beta, really stellar names as physicists. James Conant Vannevar Bush, who were senior people in the government. Charles Lauritsen, of course, a physicist at Caltech. Robert Bobbacher, physicist. David Lilienthal, who later headed the Tennessee Valley Authority. John von Neumann, of course, the famous Hungarian emigre physicist who, not physicist, mathematician, who essentially invented the science of computing. Gordon Dean, who had been I think he was the commissioner to Germany after the war. Lee DuBridge, another physicist. George Kennan, a very famous statesman who's often considered to have written the logic for the diplomacy of the Cold War. Norris Bradbury, of course, whom you'll from here. And finally, Kitty Oppenheimer, Oppenheimer's wife, who was, I think she was the last, if not one of the last witnesses, and gave a very spirited defense of her husband. Very frank and very unapologetic. Wendell Latimer, trying to remember, he was engaged in the prosecution as part of the security apparatus. This was Air Force General Roscoe Wilson, Kenneth Pitzer, Edward Teller. All of you know Teller's, and I'll introduce him in a slide in a minute, who's notably started the Livermore Laboratory later on. John Joy McCloy had been the commissioner to Germany. David Griggs was a security person. Louis Alvarez had been here during the war and was a person from Berkeley, I believe his professorship was. Boris Pash was the actual senior security, military security person during, who was quite aware of all these allegations or insinuendos against Oppenheimer, and dutifully, continuously talked to General Groves, who always put him off, saying you should, Pash might say you should fire this guy, and General Groves would say him. So then finally Borden was a congressional committee staffer who really led the charge against Oppenheimer. So here we have what I call some of the prosecution witnesses, the two most important scientific witnesses. Here's Teller. He's a theoretical physicist, group leader during the World War II here at Los Alamos on atomic and thermonuclear development, director of Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, and he had professorships at Washington U in St. Louis, University of Chicago, when I was there, as a matter of fact, UC Davis, and he ended his life as a fellow of the Hoover Institute out in Stanford. Then here's another important defense witness, I.I. Rabi, the Nobel physicist. His main field was nuclear magnetic resonance. He made the basic discoveries in that field for which he got the Nobel Prize. He's a professor at Columbia University. As you can see, he was a Los Alamos participant, and importantly, he was, for a long time, a member, and crucial Oppenheimer years, a member of the AEC, Atomic Energy Commission, General Advisory Committee. Now, all the proceedings in the testimony, here's 1,000 pages, and I do a little bit of it. A crucial part of it was, in fact, Teller's testimony. He was the only physicist of major substance who came out against Oppenheimer. Now, most of his testimony in the Gray proceedings were not particularly damaging. To Oppenheimer, he talked about his long association, even his affection. But at the end, he said this, and I'll read it in detail. In a great number of cases, I have heard Dr. Oppenheimer act. I understand that Dr. Oppenheimer acted in a way which, for me, was exceedingly hard to understand. I thoroughly disagreed with him in a number of issues, and his actions, frankly, appeared to me confused and complicated. To this extent, I feel that I would like to see the vital interests of this country in hands that I understand better and therefore trust more. This testimony from the single heavy-duty, big-time scientist who could be persuaded to testify against Oppenheimer carried great weight with the commission. Here's Rabi's testimony. I never hid my opinion from Mr. It spells Strauss, but he pronounced his name Strauss. From Mr. Strauss, that I thought this whole proceeding was a most unfortunate one. That the suspension of clearance of Dr. Oppenheimer was a very unfortunate thing and should not be done. In other words, there he was. He is a consultant, and if you don't want to consult the guy, you don't consult him, period. There is a real positive record, the way I expressed it to a friend of mine. We have the A-bomb and a whole series of, and the original has a bunch of periods there. And what more do you want? Mermaids? then comes the Gray Board's recommendation. Again, as a result of all this testimony and the recommendation, where did I put my paper? The recommendation came out at the end of these proceedings, and I'll just point out some of this as, for this reason, we've given particular attention to the question of his loyalty, and we have come to the clear conclusion, which should be reassuring to the people of this country, that he is a loyal citizen. If this were the only consideration, therefore, we would recommend that the reinstatement of his clearance would not be a danger to the common defense and security. However, they had these 4 findings as to whether his future participation would be clearly consistent with the best interests of security. We have regretfully concluded that Dr. Oppenheimer has been less than candid in several instances in his testimony before the board. That was submitted by Gordon Gray and Thomas Morgan, not because of subversion, but his intellectual prominence. And he makes it's interesting to read in the context of the times, the McCarthy times. Failure to declare Oppenheimer would be a black mark on the escutcheon of our country. And he worried about the effect of putting down Oppenheimer on the emerging science of nuclear physics. I would like to add that this opinion was written before the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, a journal at the time which expressed, I guess you could call it liberal atomic scientists' opinion. It still goes to this day. And he says, I say Dr. Oppenheimer's clearance be restored. So after that, in May, let's see, I'll remind myself. Yeah, the Gray Board reported its findings on May 27. Between that and June 29, which is a month, the commission reviewed all this, that is the AEC, the Atomic Energy Commission, heard all this, and voted 4-1 that Dr. Oppenheimer should be denied access to restricted data. Commissioners Strauss, Murray, Zuckert, and Campbell voted to deny clearance, and Commissioner Smythe voted to reinstate. And I'll go on from there. There's a picture of our commissioners. Here's Strauss on the right, who handed down their decision, the majority decision, to deny clearance to Oppenheimer. And their majority findings, they talk about disloyalty. You know, he's not disloyal. But there are other considerations on the basis of the record before the committee, comprising a transcript of the hearings before the Gray Board, as well as reports of military intelligence and FBI. We find Dr. Oppenheimer is not entitled to the continuing confidence of the government and of this commission because of a proof of fundamental defects in his character. That was basically it, fundamental defects in his character. Henry Smythe, who, as many of you probably know, wrote the famous Smythe Report directly after the bombs were exploded, which was a government report that essentially said how to build a bomb and talked about the physics considerations. Smythe was the dissenter in this case, and there's his picture. And here's a dissenting opinion. I agree with the clear conclusion of the Gray Board that he's loyal and not a security risk. No one seemed to doubt that. And he said, to me, security means whether you're going to divulge classified information. I gather that's still the base question. It's not a question of so much other things. And he says, in my opinion, there's no evidence that Dr. Oppenheimer has ever divulged any secret information. As far as it related to his conduct in the so-called hydrogen bomb program, I am not surprised to find that the evidence does not support these allegations in any way. The history of Dr. Oppenheimer's contributions to the development of nuclear weapons stands untarnished. And I conclude that his employment will not endanger, etc. I therefore vote to reinstate. So you have these two hearing panels, if you please, one of which was the Gray Board, one of which was the AEC itself. So the AEC decision came, what was it, on June 29th. That was a month after the Gray Board decision. And so now we come to Los Alamos' reaction to the verdict and where I come in. When the AEC's decision, and this was in 1954, to remove Oppenheimer's clearance became known, and it became known at the same time that people could read this book. It was met by consternation and outrage by many of the staff of the laboratory. As a result, a petition was drawn up objecting to the decision and grounds for it. The decision was circulated through the laboratory, and a total of 400 from Eisenhower himself to, I think, Bradbury, assuring him that the work of the laboratory on the thermonuclear weapons, and at that point only Los Alamos had done anything on thermonuclear weapons, that it was recognized and appreciated. That was the president, I believe, to June 13th. It talks about what was going on and the fact that Los Alamos scientists had sent the petition, and this is a list of the signers of the petition. I have that in more detail later on. This is another New Mexican thing from the time. There, David L. Hill, who at the time was, of course, working for the lab and head of the Federation of American Scientists, mentioned, signed by members of the lab to President Eisenhower from my little old house on 41st Street. And there you can see it. At the time I sent it, we had collected 282 signatures, but people were still signing the thing. But I figured it was time to. Security risk is alarming. For example, the new requirement of dispensing with the services of a loyal but unwanted consultant. As scientists engaged in national defense effort, are apprehensive that this poorly founded decision regarding Dr. Oppenheimer will make it increasingly difficult to obtain adequate scientific talent. So I'm going to, and later got a Nobel Prize for it. Louis Rosen in the audience today. Dick Toshek, Elizabeth Graves, who was almost my group leader at the time. I was in P4, she is P6. R.W. Davis was her main technician, a wonderful guy, very outspoken and irreverent. Keith Boyer, who many of you will remember from later on, he got special laboratory citation a couple of years ago. His work. Don McMillan, who did critical assembly work. Frank Harlow, who did so much development of numerical. George Bell, a theorist at the time, Frank Dunn, one of the group leaders, George Cowan, who's still very much with us, head, among other things, head of the Los Alamos National Bank, who at that time was a working radiochemist in the lab. Then Ed Hamill, Greg Dash, who was heavily involved in the effort to liquefy hydrogen, heavy hydrogen. Bill Stratton, Roger Lazarus, at that time one of the theorists, still going pretty strongly in Santa Fe. Ted Taylor, who was a weapons expert and carried his expertise outside the laboratory. Raymer Schreiber, Harris Mayer. Well, here we have Bob Thorne, who later took over the weapons division, and I remember mostly as a very enthusiastic skier who started the Pajarito ski slope. And Harris Mayer, one of the theorists who worked on the super. And Marshall Rosenbluth, who at that time was pretty young, but a student of Teller's and already a great contributor, an important contributor to the theory of the H-bomb. Nick Metropolis, Paul Stein and Nick Metropolis worked hand in glove on computation and used the so-called MANIAC computer to teach a computer to play chess. Harold Agnew. I'm not sure which of these, George Bell, one I really remember, but I put them both in, and Jerry Sudam. Carson Mark, who of course was head of the theoretical division. Bengt Carlson, one of the senior theorists, particularly numerical theorist in the lab. Harry Hoyt, who was up in the director's office. Duncan McDougall, a division. Clyde Cowan, who took the neutrino apparatus out to the reactor in what's the name of that? The reactor in South Carolina to catch the neutrinos. And then we have Herman Herlin, whom I mentioned because he was head of the division and the upper atmosphere, measuring upper atmosphere effects for bomb tests. Alvin Graves, wonderful man, who was always the scientific head of the Pacific thermonuclear tests. Bill Ogle, who was a similar head of weapons testing in the lab. Eric Jetty, one of the senior division leaders, Gerald Tenney, who started out at S-Side, I think, the development of the means of studying implosions. Duncan Curry Jr., one of the division leaders in the lab. I go through those. It's an interesting role of the people who were in the lab at that time. It's interesting to study it. Now, this is a little bit out of sequence, but it is, oh, no, this is Strauss's response to me on behalf of Eisenhower. And that's listed here in more legible form. It's too long to go through here, but he's answering essentially for Eisenhower. But his point here is that any matter which is deeply disturbing to the personnel of Los Alamos is a serious concern to me and other members of the commission. The Atomic Energy Commission does not believe that any government servant, etc., should slant advice or temper his professional opinion because of apprehension that such advice or opinion might be unpopular now or in the future. We certainly do not want yes men in the employ of the AEC. You can read this. In this debate, Dr. Oppenheimer was entitled to his opinion. I'm sure that I'm confident in view of that an understanding of all these matters in the case will lead you to the conclusion that we did right, that the commission reached the right conclusion. That was published in the New Mexican. But before then, and this is an important, thank me for the communication to the president. So there we were. We made our protest and sent the petition. Chairman Strauss did visit Alamos on July 16, and he met with a number of us. I think, as I recall, it was a fairly small group. And I made some notes, which are in the archives. He talked formally and candidly about the Gray Report. He called it a rambling document meant to achieve unanimity. That was sort of his opinion of all of this. This Murray discussion, which was a separate discussion, he knew Garrison, who you recall was the main defense attorney from the Institute for Advanced Study Board. That's an interesting thing because when Oppenheimer no longer had a clearance or could be a big figure in government defense advice, he was appointed as director of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. And actually, Strauss had something to do as a member of the board in getting that appointment for Oppenheimer. As far as he talks about by Drew Pearson and the Alsups, these were important columnists of the time, Josephine Stewart Alsup and Drew Pearson, who came down heavily against against the decision and against straws in particular. And Strauss said this showed us, the column showed a single source on to get him, Strauss. Strauss had known Lauritsen, or his surge generator, Van de Graaff. Cancer research, he stressed that he had nothing personal against Oppie. So, years afterward, when Kennedy was president, the Fermi Award was made to Oppenheimer. On November 22, 1963, and that was just before, this was done by President Kennedy, and of course, he was assassinated shortly after that. And President Johnson took over, and you can read this. Oppenheimer affected his colleagues as both catalyst and poet. Yet it is true that at times others regarded his forthrightness as abrasive. This is a quote from a book that I lifted this from. And you can see that Oppenheimer, in this picture, Oppenheimer shows the ravages of both his cancer and of the things he had been through. Hans Bethe, a long obituary for Oppenheimer in the Journal of the Academy of Sciences, the U.S. Academy of Sciences. And this is one of the last pictures of Oppenheimer. He died in 18 February 67, so he was only 63. And Bethe said, he was responsible for raising American theoretical physics from a provincial adjunct of Europe to world leadership. And to Bethe, that was one of the highest accolades he could give. Now, I have a list of references which, if you look at a copy of the CD or anything, see. I mentioned a few which some of you might want to read. Of course, Richard Rose's book, The Making of the Atomic Bomb, which got a Pulitzer Prize in '86, is a wonderful history of the whole era of nuclear physics and the atomic bomb. Ulam's book, Adventures of the Mathematician, many of you may have read it. It's an absolutely charming book. You can get it at the Historical Society Library. This is the one, above all, to be recommended. Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin's book called American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of Oppenheimer. It's a complete biography of Oppenheimer from beginning to end, including these proceedings and all the things that led up to them and all the personal interactions and everything. This Conant, who was the granddaughter of one of the witnesses I mentioned at the proceedings, wrote an equally charming book called 109 East Palace. Many of you may have read these. When I came to work in '51, I reported to 109 East Palace in Santa Fe and Dorothy McKibben. And then that was at that time, 109 East Palace in '51 was the unclassified address in Santa Fe of the laboratory. Patricia McMillan, who wrote a sort of a sister book of this trilogy, you might call it, The Ruin of J. Robert Oppenheimer and the Birth of the Modern Arms Race, and then some subsidiary references. That is the end. I would have only a few more remarks to make, very brief. One is that the J. Robert Oppenheimer Memorial Committee on August 11 is going to annual talk at the Civic Auditorium. I call it Civic Auditorium. And Martin Sherwin will be the speaker, and he'll obviously talk about matters having to do with that book. The other is that the J. Robert Oppenheimer Committee, as plaintiff, engaged with the law firm of Arnold and Porter over the last 2 years to see if at this late date a major Washington law firm could come up with any kind of legal redress for what many consider to be the injustice of the whole Oppenheimer proceedings. They have since reported to the committee on their findings, which are rather extensive. And I don't want to quote too much from this because it's a matter for the J. Robert Oppenheimer Committee. I'll just leave it at that they did find matters that are legal, that would have been legally actionable at an earlier time in the actual legality of what was done at the time. So that concludes my talk, and I thank you for your attention, and I will
please come to the mics at the center or the front here, please.
Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you, Mr. Ruby, for a wonderful presentation. My question is, of all the staff members that signed the petition, what percentage of the employees at Los Alamos Lab would that have been? What percentage do you think that would have been?
Okay, let's call it 500 at the time, 490 something. I frankly don't know. In 54, Roger, perhaps you know, what would the working staff of the lab have been? 5,000? 1,500, so it's roughly, as you can see, 20%.
Thank you. My last question is, how damaging do you think Dr. Teller's comments were, or his testimony in the proceedings, in your opinion?
My opinion is that they were very important in the proceedings. They were telling. Well, many people at the time felt so because he was the only physicist of major substance, of major national importance, who was persuaded to take up the cause of opposition. Luis Alvarez was a person who also was there, but he hadn't been on the great out in the great public the way he had. And of course, everyone knew that Teller had a very strong was a very strong supporter of the hydrogen bomb, and he was also very closely associated with the cause of the United States Air Force, who had a strong interest in the development of thermonuclear weapons for their own purposes as weapon. So my answer is yes, it was very important.
So if I remember correctly, some books have characterized that this whole affair was came out of personal vindictiveness out of Strauss. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that. And you indicated that he helped get it at the Institute. So is there...
Yes. In my presentation, I've tried not to prejudice the conclusions by such consideration. But if you read, for instance, the Byrd-Sherwin book, there's no question but what Strauss had a strong personal animosity against Oppenheimer, and it was standing from the 50s, from the earlier 50s, when Oppenheimer, as a matter of record, had treated him in a humiliating way in, for instance, testimony to Congress and what have you, dismissed him cavalierly. And Oppenheimer, as any of you who may, probably there's no one here but Louis that remembers him personally, be abrasive and he could be arrogant, and probably Strauss was not the only person that he antagonized.
You kind of implied that his opposition to the super development was part of the reason that they considered it.
Wait, I'm not getting that.
You kind of implied that his opposition to developing the super was part of their argument that he was disloyal. He didn't want us to develop hydrogen fusion weapons, and was it his just the way that he? I mean, the letter kind of implied that he was kind of loose the way he talked about things, that he may have revealed things inadvertently because he. I guess we're kind of left wondering, why? When the record was so positive, it helped develop the bomb. Why? Yeah.
Well, as I mentioned in one of my slides, this whole super versus Teller-Ulam concept thing really clouded the issue at the beginning. And when Oppenheimer, when Truman said in 50, go gung-ho on this thing, we've barely been out of the era when Teller and others had been pushing to develop the super, even though that was an act of faith. Go ahead and do big development on the super and hope that something good comes along. So Oppenheimer, on scientific grounds, opposed the super, and when he saw, when the Teller-Ulam concept came along, he called the physics sweet, meaning he recognized that would go. He did, on idealistic grounds, however, on the hustings, with this Vista group, for instance, say, okay, basically, let's avoid an arms race. Let's get the American public in on what's going on, and let's try to dialogue with the Soviets. So that kind of thing, was damning in conservative quarters, say.
Thank you. In the lone dissenting voice, Mr. Smythe lamented lost science. Can you characterize any avenues or lost opportunities that, with Oppenheimer out, that was missed, or did Teller and Ullman, was there so much momentum there that it didn't matter if Oppenheimer was there or not?
Now, I'm not sure I got all that because my hearing may not have picked it all up.
I'm sorry, was the dissenting voice of Mr. Smythe where he indicated there would be a loss of science?
Yes.
Was that in reality? I mean, can you characterize some loss?
Now, if I get the import, of course, here's Smythe talking here. I think you might be thinking a little more of let's see, no, Evans's testimony where is it? Where he was afraid that, that doing this to Oppenheimer would drive people out of nuclear physics and out of government work. Am I getting the gist of what you asked?
Yeah, or did Oppenheimer's absence result in a loss of scientific advancement?
You know, of all the people who signed that, very few of them, including me, chose to resign over it. Certainly not Bradbury. And none of these people did, so that's one answer to your question. The plain truth is that before the hearings in the spring of '54, Oppenheimer had largely faded into the background because onto the Institute, and he was being used less and less as a consultant. So his actually leaving the scene didn't have that much effect. His leaving the scene did carve out his place in history and made a great deal of outrage in the public and sort of established him in extra government circles and public overseas and what have you as an elder statesman of science and philosophy.
Thank you all for coming.